Says try again. Okay, it's up. Okay, who's jumping on today? Give me a shout out in the chat box. Hey, Kelsey. Hey, Grace. Hey, Colton. Yeah, I coughed into my hand. I'll wipe it off. What's up, Charlie? Wow, Lauren's saying good morning to everybody. You're so polite. Beautiful day today. Anybody going to do anything exciting outside? Hi, Priscilla. Bike ride sounds like a good idea. Hey, while a few more people get signed in here, just a question to kind of start the day. You can jump on the chat box and throw this in there. If you ranked the miracles of Jesus, and they're a big deal, they're all through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Many of them are repeated in multiple Gospels. The one we're looking at today is in all 4 of the Gospels. But if you think through for a second the miracles that are recorded that Jesus did, which one is your favorite? It could be for all sorts of different reasons, but what is your favorite miracle? Jot that in the chat box quick. We'll see what we have. Kelsey says the story I did last week. I think that's just brown nosing. Yeah, Lazarus was a pretty big deal. Feeding 5,000. Well, you guys add those as you think about miracles. I mentioned this 2 weeks ago in the first Trent talk, but a lot of people struggle with how could miracles have happened. But we realize that the Gospels are full of them. You take the miracles out, there's not much news about Jesus. So either people colluded, multiple writers over multiple years colluded to make a bunch of stuff up, and everybody believed it enough to keep these books around for us to be reading 2,000 years later, or the stuff really happened. And these people were passionate about making sure they got to tell their story so people understood who Jesus was and what he really could do. Because he could do that, prove that he was God. John, the gospel we're kind of working our way through in these Trent talks, only includes about 7, I believe, of the miracles. He wrote his gospel maybe 50 years or so after Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So he knew what they had written down. They had covered dozens of the miracles. But he picked out specifically 7 that really helped him make his points. And he said at the end of the book, this would be in John 20, verses 30 and 31, The disciples saw Jesus do many other miraculous signs in addition to the ones recorded in this book. But these are written so you may continue to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing in him, you will have life by the power of his name. He had a very clear purpose for including these miracles in his book. He knew it sounded crazy and it was hard to believe. But he said it proved who Jesus was. We got Peter walking on the water, a bunch of more feeding the 5,000s, which is interesting because that's where we turn today. And I asked the question, does it ever feel like what Jesus asked you to do is impossible? Scripture gives us many directions, kind of goals, principles to follow. And sometimes it seems like that is so hard in our world today. Jesus just can't relate to 2020. Well, I think this miracle definitely fits that category. We've talked about Jesus turning water into wine, talked about healing a guy that had been lame for 38 years last week. And today we turn to what several of you mentioned, Jesus feeding the 5,000. It is in John chapter 6. I'm actually going to flip over to Matthew 14 for a slightly shorter version. So Matthew 14, verse 13, it says this. As soon as Jesus heard the news, now you stop, when you read scripture, you should try to understand all you can. The news is that John the Baptist, his cousin, had just been beheaded. A pretty sad day for Jesus. So he had heard the news. He left in a boat to a remote area to be alone. But the crowds heard where he was headed and followed on foot from many towns. So as the boat's going across the lake, all these little towns around the waterfront said, Jesus is in that boat, and they're following him along the shoreline or in their own boats. So Jesus saw a huge crowd as he stepped from the boat, and he had compassion on them and healed their sick. So again, Matthew, Mark, and Luke share many times when Jesus healed sick people. We did the story last week of the lame man. John just kind of throws it in here. He healed a bunch of sick people out of the hundreds, or as you find out later, thousands of people here along the shoreline. That evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place, and it's getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy food for themselves." But Jesus said, "That's not necessary. You feed them." Does it ever seem like what Jesus asked us to do is impossible? The disciples can relate. 5,000 men, their wives, their kids, and Jesus says, "You feed them." The disciples replied, "But we only have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish," they answered. They were already worried for themselves. 12 of them, 13 counting Jesus, they didn't even have half a loaf and a sixth of a fish per person. And now Jesus says, "You feed them." Sometimes, only 2 points today, really. And the first one I've already stated. Sometimes it seems like what Jesus asks us to do is impossible. Sometimes it seems like what Jesus asks is impossible. So we make excuses. We start sentences with the word but we only have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. We focus on what we have. We fail to focus rather on what we have. Rather, we focus on what we don't have. We think about why we can't follow Jesus instead of taking the first step to follow him. So in your Zoom calls, those of you that are in campus life clubs and jump on a Zoom call right after this Trent talk, ask yourselves, what is clearly God's will that sometimes seems really tough to do? What excuses do we make? How do we focus on why we can't do that instead of focusing on how we should begin to do that? What actions should we be taking to take that first step of obeying God? So what is clearly God's will that sometimes seems tough to do? What excuses do we make? And what baby step or step instead could we take to begin to obey God? It might be obeying your parents, which is probably popping up during this quarantine time. Purity in your media choices as you spend 48 hours a day online. the normal things we always talk about in campus life: substance abuse, sexual purity, sexual actions. There are some tough, or at least seems tough, guidelines in Scripture. So talk through some of those in your Zoom time. I think that could be interesting. But we need to finish the story. Jesus said, "Bring them here, the 5 loaves and 2 fishes." Then he told the people to sit down in the grass. He took the 5 loaves and 2 fish. He looked up to heaven and blessed them. Then breaking the loaves into pieces, he gave the bread to the disciples, who distributed it to the people. They ate as much as they wanted. And afterward, the disciples picked up 12 baskets of leftovers. About 5,000 men were fed that day, in addition to all the women and children. So the last thing today, chew on this for a sec. You only need to do what you can do, and trust God to do what only he can do. Now, this is a crazy extreme. Maybe 15,000 people fed with 5 loaves and 2 fishes. Hard to wrap your mind around how that happened, but all 4 gospel writers report that this is exactly what they saw with their own eyes in most cases. The disciples could ask, how can we do that with 5 loaves? Or they could just start passing it out. They only needed to do what they could do. We only need to do what we can do. You only need to do what you can do, and trust God to do what only he can do. We have to simply take a step in the right direction. Yoked to Jesus. We talked about a yoke last week on Trent's Talk and Monday Night in Campus Life. The verse in Matthew 11, 28 through 30. Yoked to Jesus, we can take steps in the journey God calls us to be, no matter how tough the times are, how tough the soil is at that moment. We simply need to walk alongside and let him do what only he can do. GPS gives us a really good word picture for that. I love maps. I know maps all over this country. I've driven on thousands of roads, but I just drove 3,950 miles January and February from here through North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, and home. And I went from place to place. I think we stayed in 6 or 7 different places. I would just enter the address. And when you enter an address in your GPS, what comes up on the screen? Where you are and just the next turn. And those of you, probably most of you, getting really good at using that. You'd probably use it just to drive across town. But it tells you just the next turn. You don't worry about that. You put the car in drive and go. And when you make that turn, what does your GPS do? Gives you the next turn. You only have to do what you can do and let God do, or GPS in this case, what GPS does. But ultimately, what does it do? It gets you to the destination. So God has a great plan for every one of our lives. He made you. He loves you. He cares about the choices you make. And his directions given in his word are literally step-by-step directions to help you get to where he wants you to go in life and to become the person he wants you to be. You only need to do what you can do. Let God do what only he can do. It's not impossible. Trust God today. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back next week. See you later.